basically review what's happened. So during the Arab Spring, what was it, about 14 years ago or 13 years ago, there was basically launched a civil war in Syria. The civil war was primarily launched by elements within Syria associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, associated with radical Islam, who opposed kind of the secular governance of the Assads. It was also a Sunni Shiite thing. The Assad family is from the Alawite sect of Shiite Islam. It is a small minority within Syria, but it is a minority that has always held kind of the intellectual high ground. It is a minority that has always been very influential in the military. And indeed, it is a minority that has dominated Syrian politics for the last 50 years under the Assads. Not only have the Alawites been taken most of the positions, high positions in the government, but also in the military and in other institutions of the state. Hafiz al-Assad came to power about 50 years ago. Hafiz al-Assad is the father. He's dead, a secular leader of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is a fascist party modeled very much after Mussolini's fascist party. The Ba'ath Party platform is very much a copy of Mussolini's platform. Bashar al-Assad, the one who just escaped to Russia, is the son of Hafiz al-Assad, and they have ruled Syria as dictators, as fascist dictators and oppressors in brutal form, against all opposition for the last 50 or so years. Now, let's be clear, the opposition primarily has been, over those 50 years, the primary opposition has been from Sunni Muslims. Syria is majority Sunni. Again, the Alawites are Shiite. Shiites are associated with Iran, with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is Shiite, but Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, most of the Gulf states are mostly a majority Sunni. So this is a split in Islam between Sunni and Shia. Anyway, Syria is majority Sunni, and yet this minority held a dictatorial grip over them. But the majority Sunni, the dominant players within the majority Sunni coalition, if you want to call it, were Islamists, jihadis, Muslim Brotherhood. And indeed, in the late 1970s, there was a rebellion against Hafiz al-Assad from the north, from the same area where the rebels now attacked and ultimately took over Syria, from Homs. Homs is a city to the north of Damascus in the northern part of Syria, which the rebels took just a couple of days ago, and then after that, the road was open to Damascus. Anyway, in Homs, in the late 1970s, there was a rebellion against Hafiz al-Assad, and by the Muslim Brotherhood, local Muslim Brotherhood. Assad basically flattened the city. Accounts vary, but anywhere between 10 to 40,000 people died in Homs in Hafiz al-Assad's attack. He was, as we said, a brutal dictator, and one who was very much opposed to Israel. He was the one who participated in the 1973 war, and also was very involved in the various civil wars in Lebanon, including in fighting Israel in 1982 in Lebanon. Bashar al-Assad was a son, and when he first took the reins, there was a lot of hope that he would be a moderating liberal force. He had been educated in the West, he had many Western mannerisms, and there was real hope that he would be a moderating force in Syria. He was not. Again, a brutal dictator. And in 2011, with the Arab Spring, when people started demonstrating in Damascus, primarily for more freedom, more liberty, more elections which probably would have brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power, Bashar al-Assad crushed those demonstrations and basically launched Syria into a civil war. At this point, the civil war, the people opposed to Bashar al-Assad basically fragmented into many groups. The Muslim Brotherhood is a significant group, but basically the Muslim Brotherhood is the underlying Islamist group from many different groups that hate each other and despise each other. For a while, if you remember, ISIS controlled much of eastern Syria and controlled much of Iraq. ISIS was beaten back primarily by the Russians. So one of the elements to bring in here is that during the civil war, when Bashar al-Assad seemed like he might be losing, he created two alliances that ultimately resulted in him being able to survive until now. One with the Russians. The Russians basically came to the rescue and brought in their Air Force and combat troops on the ground and basically beat back primarily ISIS and destroyed their capacity to attack Bashar al-Assad and basically stabilized his regime. The reason the Russians came in is because Syria is perfectly located for what the Russians want. The Russians have lost really much of their influence in the Middle East. They used to be, during the Cold War, very influential in the Middle East. They were the dominant player in Iraq, in Syria, for a while early on in the Cold War in Egypt. But they had lost all that, and they came back as a foothold in the Middle East into Syria after the civil war broke out. But they also had a strategic interest. Syria is on the way to Africa. It is a way station for them. They have a lot of interest in Africa. They still do. But also, Syria provided the Russian Navy with basically a port in the Mediterranean. Syria has no other presence really in the Mediterranean. NATO does. NATO has ports all along the Mediterranean, potentially, and NATO countries all along the Mediterranean. And yet the Russians had no presence. So they established a port in Latakia in northwestern Syria. And there's an Air Force base there. There's a port there. And this was the deal they cut with Assad. We get to use these facilities indefinitely, and we will help protect your regime. The second alliance Bashar al-Assad established during this period in trying to protect his regime and trying to fend off the Sunni rebels, the civil war, was with Hezbollah and really with Iran. Think about 9/11. After 9/11, Iran basically came to dominate Iraq. This is the great success of the United States in bringing democracy to Iraq, was basically handing Iraq over on a silver platter to the Iranians. I would argue the U.S.'s main enemy in the Middle East. So Iran had a presence in Iraq, and Iran also had a presence in Lebanon through the Hezbollah, which it has supported since the 1980s, early 1980s, and helped establish the Hezbollah in the 1980s. Getting Syria sits between Lebanon and Iraq, was a major coup for the Iranians. That is a deal with Bashar al-Assad that allowed them to transport troops, arms, weapons through Syria all the way to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Was an enormous coup for the Iranians. It basically allowed the Iranians to dominate the entire Fertile Crescent from Lebanon through Syria, through Iraq, all the way to Iran itself. And Iran, during this period, in the 20-teens, became the dominant power in the Middle East, other than Israel. And it not only fueled the growth of Hezbollah, it fueled the success or the preservation of the Assad regime. It fueled the various governments in Iraq, and then, of course, it expanded into the Houthis in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia felt like it was surrounded. In the north, it had Syria and Iraq. In the south, it had Yemen. And also, of course, fueled Hamas in Gaza. So this was an era of peak Iranian influence. Hezbollah in return for the Iranian, the ability to travel through Syria and the ability to really dominate Syria and to be the main force within Syria, the Iranians provided the Assad regime with troops, basically Hezbollah. Hezbollah had thousands of fighters in Syria. They helped in the civil war. They crushed the rebellion. And for a while there, Bashar al-Assad looked quite comfortable. Indeed, until a few days ago, Bashar al-Assad looked pretty comfortable. He dominated central Syria. His forces controlled much of Syria, all the way up close to the Turkish border in the north. Some to the east, although eastern Iraq was, to some extent, was controlled by the Kurds. Northeastern Iraq was controlled by the Kurds, who are affiliated with the United States. But again, there were territories controlled by other parties other than the Assad regime, but they were relatively small and they were deemed relatively weak, and all these forces were splintered. There's about 20 different opposition forces out there in Syria, and they were deemed as weak because they disagreed with one another pretty much on everything. Some of them were Islamists, some of them were more democratic, some of them were moderate Islamists, some of them were ISIS. ISIS still has a presence there. So, you had this situation until a few really days ago where Hezbollah and Iran and Russia were propping up the Assad regime and basically held at bay this array of disparate opposition forces that were sprinkled all over Syria, in the north, in the east, and in the south. So that was the situation until a few days ago. A force in the north, an Islamist force in the north, but a, quote, moderate Islamist force, a splinter group from ISIS, whose leader used to be a senior commander in ISIS and splintered away and has supposedly moderated and aligned himself with the Turks, have been weaponizing themselves over the last few years, have been organizing, and have also created over the last few months, reasonable relationships with the other opposition forces, the other splinter groups that are all fighting the Assad regime. And on the 27th of November, they launched an attack in northern Syria, basically within days taking the largest city in Syria, Aleppo, in the north, and then starting to sweep to the south. The Kurds in the east took this opportunity to basically expand their influence on eastern Iraq and northeastern Iraq, and they basically now control almost all of Syria. They basically control all of eastern Syria, which is all desert. There's nothing there, but they control basically all of it. In the south, some of the opposition forces, again, this woke them up and they started fighting and pushing back against the Assad regime, to the point where, as of yesterday, a few days before yesterday, they took Hama and then Homs, where the famous attack by Hafez al-Assad in the 1970s occurred. They took Hama and Homs, and ultimately yesterday they entered Damascus. Bashar al-Assad was forced to flee with his family. Reports are that he has been granted asylum in Russia and that he is now in Moscow, which makes complete sense to me. In the meantime, Russia has evacuated its ports. It has basically loaded up whatever ships it had with anything that it could and gotten out of there. They have, for the most part, evacuated the Air Force base and tried to get as many troops out. But the reality is that Russia is out of Syria. It has lost its dominant position in Syria. This is a major blow to Putin and a major blow to Russian prestige and Russian influence in the world. And as of 2 days ago, Hezbollah fighters were running away from Syria. They were trying to escape into Lebanon. Supposedly, Israel was bombing their retreat routes and trying to kill and destroy as many of them as possible before they reached Lebanon. So Hezbollah was abandoning the Assad regime and escaping. Iran cut a deal with the rebels to evacuate its personnel and the militias that are associated with the Iranian regime. Iran had significant forces inside Syria, both to supply Hezbollah, but also as a potential threat to Israel. All of those forces have been forced to leave Syria and return to Iran. So what you have right now is rebel forces controlling all of Syria. Nobody knows what happens next because, again, these rebel forces don't like each other. They have very different ideologies. They have different visions of the future of Syria. Many of them Islamist forces, so they're a kind of crazy religious, anti-Western, really dangerous forces, and it's hard to tell what their agenda is going to be exactly. Do they want to establish Sharia law in Syria? Are they willing to have elections? If you have election, who wins? It's not even clear who would win such an election, given the split. It very much appears like Iraq, the anarchy and mess that is Iraq, but with one difference, and that is that the Sunni-Shiite split is less of an issue in Syria. The Sunnis dominate. In Iraq, it's 55-45, 60-40, something like that. It's very close. In Syria, it's not even close to that. So again, it's hard to tell where we go from here.